So now let's look at bus stops. Julia Cunningham is with us today. Julia is from East Guernsey Schools. And Julia, why don't you take us through what your subgroup on the task force came up with bus stop procedures?
Okay, thank you, Pete. Good morning to all. We started with leaving home to arrive at the bus stop. Parents must assure that students do not have any of the COVID-19 symptoms, and we listed those for you. Next slide. We're asking that students wash their hands thoroughly prior to arriving at the bus stop, maintain social distancing with parents there supervising and helping with that. Students should wear a mask at the bus stop and on the school bus, obviously unless there's a medical reason that they cannot. We will provide a mask if the students do not have one. The mask must cover their nose and mouth. If you equip your buses with hand sanitizer, we would request the students sanitize their hands when boarding. When arriving at the school, we would unload from front to back and stay 6 feet apart when exiting. Students will be directed which door to enter the school, and we won't discharge all buses at once. We would make sure that they maintain that social distancing. They're going to keep their masks on when they exit the bus and walking through sidewalk or unloading areas. We're asking them that they do not pass each other in the aisle or in the unloading zone when unloading. Students are going to line up in the after. Okay, now we're going to talk about PM. We're going to request they line up by bus number and the order of their bus stop to avoid them passing each other on the bus in the seat. Obviously, we're going to ask they wear masks again and leave them on while riding. They're going to go directly to their assigned seat with no moving seats, and then hand sanitizing if that's provided. We're going to request that they ride their assigned bus only with no passes or transfers in order to maximize the contact tracing and accountability. Drivers are going to remind students to stay socially distanced as they exit the bus for their place of safety, and we're going to have them keep their masks on at the bus stop when they exit. The administrative tasks for the school loading zones, and this will be a big part of the transportation world, is that we're going to have to coordinate arrival times and stagger the loading and unloading times in order to maintain that social distance. We're going to designate different entries for bus riders, car riders, and walkers to minimize congregation of students. We're asking that the waiting areas have sufficient space and supervision to maintain social distancing. We're going to consult with HVAC experts with additional sources for air circulation in the areas where students will be waiting to board or unload. We're going to set up portable hand sanitizing stations in the loading areas. And I lost my page, sorry. And they're going to, if they display symptoms of infection, we will not be permitting them to ride home on the bus at the end of the day.
Great, thanks, Julia. And so again, one of the things you see the subgroup has come up with is that for us to successfully restart transportation, we need to think of this as a partnership. There are things that the students need to do, but we also need parental assistance at the bus stops. A couple of chat comments have noted that sometimes we say shall, sometimes we say should. Please bear in mind that the work we're doing is dynamic, it changes, and we'll continue to monitor things. For some of the recommendations here, actually for all the recommendations, know that ultimately it's going to be a local decision. And I would go back to the references in ODE's reset and restart guidance, and that is ultimately we can offer you guidance. We can share with you what we believe are best practices. We've looked at what's here in Ohio. We've also looked at what's going on in other states and other guidance is coming out. Ultimately, you'll have to decide what you implement locally, knowing that under the current Ohio structure, ODH and your local Board of Health will have an awful lot of authority in things that they can say. I'm going to run through the routing recommendations. The members of those subgroup are all tied up with district administrative chores today. We did roll this out a couple of weeks ago, so I will be skipping some of the slides here, but I do want to hit the high points. An important prerequisite for good routing is that we've got to create certain precautions and take steps prior to the resumption of the school transportation routing. So it's not just a matter of, okay, let's route them and get the buses running and put the kids on there. Everybody at the table needs to be on the same page and be aware of the actions that are needed in order to keep both staff and students safe on the bus. The key to running our routes, let's face it, is going to be to protect our staff. There is a limited pool of bus drivers. Pretty much every district in the state, in fact, in the country, has had a hard time recruiting, hiring, and training new bus drivers. And so we have to protect the drivers that we've got. In order to do that, drivers, bus monitors, aides, and paraprofessionals, here it says should wear personal protective equipment. We know that the guidance that just came out late last week says that they are required to wear a mask or a face shield. So that certainly needs to be in place. The team believes that every bus should carry a supply of temporary masks for students who come to the bus without a mask. Cleaning and sanitizing products should be carried on the bus in a closed container. And our routing team is recommending that the front row of seats be kept empty to protect the driver. You can add driver protective barriers. The State Patrol has approved that. We'll talk about that when we get into the bus equipment section. Likewise, you can add a hand sanitizer station to your bus also. If you need to control ridership, and let's face it, if we need to limit the number of students on a bus, and we may indeed have to do that, here are some ideas for you to consider. Home to school transportation for career, technical, and vocational students is not required in the law. The state minimum for these students is a transfer from the high school campus to the vocational campus. You might want to consider limiting after school transportation. You might want to consider limiting field trips and extracurricular field trips. In fact, there's very specific language about this in both ODE and ODH's guidelines that came out last week saying that field trips are not a good idea at this point in time. You should consider limiting any bus needs that interfere with regular route service. And so, what are those trips? It's not uncommon to have athletic trips that want to leave during the route hour in the afternoon. So then we have to pull buses off our routes. We're going to be struggling this fall just to provide enough buses and drivers with social distancing for students just going home to school and school to home. So we believe districts would want to consider eliminating all those interfering trips. Students should be limited to a single stop, include shared parenting scenarios. So this will be a little bit different. In the past, we've accommodated pretty much any requests that came down the pike. But what we're going to have to do is make sure that every student is assigned to a single seat in a single bus. That saves us extra seats on other bus. It also will facilitate contact tracing should the need for that arise. Consider eliminating special passes for alternate stops, and consider eliminating stops for commercial childcare stops. If social distancing is mandated in your community and excess fleet capacity does not exist, you might want to consider the following ways of reducing rider counts. So here's the primary tenet of this slide. If we're going to limit the number of students on a bus, but the district still wants to transport the same number of students, you'll need more buses and more drivers. You may have more buses. Almost none of our districts have more drivers. And so what that means is if we limit capacity, we're probably going to have to decrease the number of riders that we're serving. So here's the notion. Increase the size of the no transportation zones around the schools where it is safe to walk, bike to and from school. These zones can be up to 2 miles from the school of attendance. Eliminate high school bus service so that your high school buses can be reallocated to students in grades kindergarten through 8. Routing changes, including reduced capacity and adding bus stops and modifying routes to accommodate bell schedules, will require additional routing time for planning as well as added expenses. So here's the bottom line is if your district needs to make a change midstream, know that unless those routes are rewritten and ready to go, it's going to take a little bit of time to reconfigure them. You also are going to have time to notify the parents. So this goes back to the ODE guidance saying that, you know, if we have to make changes midstream, and we may have to, depending upon different levels of infection in your community, we may have to change how we do business. And it's not a matter of changing from one day to the next. We may need a little bit of time in order to accommodate that. So here's some considerations for bus stops. There's a couple of questions in the chat room right now about bus stop considerations. You know, we've seen it written in some other guidances that maybe what we need to do is add additional bus stops to decrease the number of students and increase social distancing. Well, if we do that, that will result in longer routes and potentially the need for additional buses. We don't have more buses, and in many of our districts, we're not going to be able to run longer routes because we also need extra time between the routes to clean and sanitize the buses. Another way to manage social distancing at the bus stop is to ask parents to monitor students at the bus stop. And here again, we need the parents to step up and be our partners in transportation. And if they can manage the students in the stop and enforce social distancing, then we can keep the children safe at the stop. This way, we don't have to disrupt the routes by rescheduling them and adding more stops to the routes. Drop-off and pickup points at school campuses need to be carefully managed. That's a time of the day when we typically see a lot of congestion on the campus. And so we may want to think about staggering the bus arrival and departure times. And then school administrators also need to think very carefully about designating particular entrances for bus riders, parent drop-offs, and walkers to keep all these students separated. Buses should be unloaded or loaded separately and not all at the same time. And again, this will take some coordination with the routers and the district staff. Here's some miscellaneous considerations a part of the routing scheme. Driver rooms will need to be eliminated or streamlined to cut down on time spent inside the office. Might want to consider one-way pedestrian traffic flow in the driver's room. Consider different ways for drivers to check in upon arrival. Nicole talked a little bit about that with staff training. Some districts may require drivers and other onboard staff to have temperature taken upon reporting to work. If buses need to be sanitized between routes, it's very likely the bell times are going to have to be adjusted to spread out the school days so that there's time for this task. Reducing the number of riders per bus without otherwise reducing total ridership will increase transportation costs to the district. And for those of you who didn't see it, State of Ohio just published a notice yesterday morning that the fiscal 21 budget is again going to be reduced just like the fiscal 20 budget was. So we're looking at things that could increase our cost. At the same time, our funding is going down. Buses should be operated with vents and windows open to maximize airflow through the vehicle. Health officials have made it clear that the rate of infection is decreased when you're outdoors or when natural airflow is enhanced. So use your roof hatches. If you pop the front hatch open in the front and the back hatch open in the back, then what you'll do is you will be moving air through the vehicle and you can take advantage of fresh airflow. So let's talk one more thing here about bus stops, and want to kind of build up to a key point in this slide. Our students, we know, are most at risk when they're at the bus stop, and our bus drivers have been challenged not only here in Ohio but across the country with keeping children safe at the bus stop. If you look at what started happening a number of years ago, and it was really bad last year, where we had distracted motorists running through school bus stop signs and striking children and killing them, we have to remember that the bus driver's job at the bus stop is really to keep the children safe. And that bus stop is probably the most critical part of school transportation. We've got to continue to follow the current boarding procedures that our drivers have been taught to keep students safe. So when at a bus stop, the driver's got one hand on the horn, foot on the brake, and the other hand is used for signaling the students to board the bus. Their eyes and their vision are continuing to roam. They have to watch traffic. They have to watch the students. They have to watch the inside of the bus. Here's the bottom line. Drivers cannot check student temperatures as they board the bus unless they don't do something else. So if we insist on drivers checking student temperatures as the kids get on, then we're putting the children at safety, and we have to look at the best common good here. We cannot jeopardize the safety of students at the bus stop. Likewise, drivers cannot squirt hand sanitizer into students' hands as they walk by. This does two things. One is it distracts the driver. It also causes closer contact with the student, and it's going to interfere with our safe boarding procedures. We really need parents and parent representatives to be at the bus stop with children to keep them safe and enforce social distancing. And that way we can, if everybody's working together, then we can get them up into the bus. There's a question here about how would the driver do required hand signals with a shield on the right. I should point out, and in the bus equipment presentation a little bit later, in Ohio, we have not approved putting in shields to the right of the driver, only to the rear of the driver. So what's the parental role in school transportation? Communication with parents is essential. If we want students to go back to the classroom and we want them to safely ride a bus, parents are going to have to help us out. So here's some key tenets. Students should only be assigned to one bus and one driver. Whenever possible, students should ride the same bus in the morning and in the afternoon. School bus drivers are in short supply. If school transportation is going to work, we've got to minimize the health risk to the drivers. All students should be required to wear a mask to board the school bus, and they should be required to keep it on until after they leave the school vehicle. Obviously, our school buildings may have their own rules in place, and whatever they adopt also needs to be followed. We just need to make sure that students keep their masks on while they're on the school bus. Parents must check their child's temperature each morning and should not send their child to the bus if they have a temperature over 100.4 degrees. If a student becomes ill while at school, school transportation shall not be used to transport the student home. A parent or a parent representative will need to pick up the student at school. And we have to remember again that routing adjustments due to address or school changes will take longer, as the transportation staff have to very carefully manage bus loads and routing capacity. So here's the question that's getting asked. How many children can we put on a bus? And so what our task force has put together is a tiered transportation model. And we have looked at 4 different risk models. That's common with most of the recommendation plans that are coming out from other states and around the country. In a no risk model, where there's little or no viral infection in the community, a district might want to consider going to regularly scheduled routing with no changes in capacity. In a low risk model, not none, but low risk model, where there's low viral infection rate in the community, moderately well contained, the task force is suggesting you don't want more than 2 students per seat. Siblings shall sit together. The row of seats behind the driver should be left empty, You could use the seat behind the driver for storing PPE equipment. The seat across from the driver should be used for new enrollments, but optimally, we'd like to see the row of seats behind the driver left empty. As students board the bus, they need to load from the back to the front. So they need to walk directly to their seat, filling the back seats up in the morning, and then dismiss front to back when they arrive at the building. In the afternoon, students will need to board the bus from back to front, again, in the order they depart the bus. In a moderate risk involvement, where viral infection rate is pronounced in the community, then we need to look at a model where we reduce the capacity in the school bus. And the task force is suggesting no more than one student per seat. Siblings can sit together. Again, the row of seats behind the driver should be left empty. Reduce the ridership pool by increasing walking distance around the school. So this goes back to what we mentioned a couple slides ago. If you're going to reduce the capacity in each bus, we don't have more buses, we don't have more drivers, so we're going to have to reduce the number of students that are eligible. So you're going to have to reduce your ridership pool. As a district, you may need to consider state minimum busing, which is students in grades K through 8 that live more than 2 miles away. We're suggesting that any changes in transportation, if a student moves or, becomes newly enrolled, changes are going to take a little bit longer because we're going to have to be more careful with how we're routing and rerouting buses. And again, students boarding the bus from back to front, and you'll see this in all the models, they need to board in order, fill from the back, and then empty from the front. In a high-risk model, while viral infection rate is increasing, and if you relate this back to the state map that the governor rolled out last week and in high-risk communities, if your community is at high risk, you might want to consider terminating transportation service. And what we looked at was the CDC recommendation considering one child every other seat. That pretty much makes a bus an impractical mode of transportation. If you put one student every other seat in a 65 passenger bus, you leave the front row empty, you've only got 9 or 10 students on that vehicle. And we don't believe there's any way that you can effectively use your fleet without discriminating or prioritizing certain students. When you do that, in essence, in a high-risk model, you probably can't use a school bus. You could consider recommending state minimum busing to reduce service, but again, what we're going to look at is no more than one student per every other seat sitting diagonally, and that's pretty hard to do bus routing. When you're used to carrying 30, 40, and 50 students on a bus, and then you shrink that down to 10 to 11, you really don't have an effective transportation system. The row of seats behind the driver needs to be left empty, and then routing is going to have to be adjusted per your local policies. And again, this might be students go to school 2 days and they're off 3 days. And so, here's where we're going to get into some pretty extreme adjustments on the routing plan. Students will need to board the bus again, front to back, and then unload from back to front. So the bottom line is we've got 4 different tiered models. In a high-risk model, there's some question about whether transportation is even possible to provide. And then in a low-risk model or a no-risk model, we could have minimum impact. So every community is going to have to decide what works best for them. I want to circle back to one question, and somebody's asked, could we use bus aides on the bus instead of the drivers to rely on doing temperatures or masks or squirting hand sanitizer? We've got 2 issues to contend with at the bus stop. One is we need the bus driver to remain focused on what's going on around the student in the bus. But the second thing is if we extend the amount of time that bus is stopped at the stop, all of us as school transportation practitioners know the longer the bus is stopped, the more tendency is there for traffic to go flying around the bus. And we don't want to exacerbate that scenario. The other thing we have to be careful of is what kind of a social environment are we going to create if one particular student's temperature is too high and then we have to single them out and send them home? We really need the parents to do these health screenings at home before their child comes to the bus stop.